The political and technological landscape of the United States continues its relentless churn, marked by a flurry of high-stakes decisions and contentious exchanges from the White House this week. From the president directly addressing public speculation about his recent activities to a series of impactful rulings and policy announcements that ripple across domestic and international spheres, the administration's actions are drawing sharp reactions and setting the stage for significant future battles, particularly at the intersection of executive power, state autonomy, and the evolving digital economy. President Donald Trump, in a move widely seen as an effort to quell swirling rumors about his brief absence, took questions at the White House, asserting his active presence amidst a period of intense policy rollouts. This public appearance coincided with a series of aggressive domestic policy declarations, most notably his intent to deploy the National Guard to what he described as hellhole cities like Chicago and Baltimore, aiming for a troop-led crime crackdown. This announcement immediately ignited a firestorm of opposition, with Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker vehemently pushing back, labeling Trump's comments as unhinged. Governor Pritzker detailed his expectations of federal agents, potentially from ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, being staged around Chicago, anticipating raids on Latino communities under the guise of targeting violent criminals, and expressed concerns about the potential for active-duty military deployment. This follows a federal court in San Francisco ruling Trump's earlier deployment of National Guard troops to Los Angeles in June as illegal, a decision California Governor Gavin Newsom has leveraged by filing an injunction against any attempts to renew the deployment, critically noting, "The timing of Trump's extension of the National Guard soldiers isn't coincidental. He's holding on to soldiers through Election Day." The ongoing legal and political skirmishes underscore a growing tension between federal authority and state sovereignty, raising profound questions about civil liberties and the appropriate use of military force domestically. In a pivotal development for the technology sector, U.S. District Court Judge Amit Mehta issued a ruling in the 5-year-long antitrust lawsuit against Alphabet, Google's parent company. While stopping short of the federal prosecutors' and antitrust advocates' demands to dismantle the tech giant by forcing the sale of assets like its Chrome browser or Android operating system, the court mandated that Alphabet must share information gathered from its search engine functions with qualified competitors. Furthermore, Judge Mehta tightened restrictions on the exclusive agreements Alphabet uses to ensure its technology dominates smartphones and other computing devices. The Department of Justice has indicated it is considering next options for seeking additional relief, suggesting this ruling may not be the final word in the government's efforts to rein in the market power of tech giants. This decision, emerging from a lawsuit initiated under the Biden administration and continuing into the Trump presidency, highlights the persistent regulatory scrutiny faced by major technology platforms and its potential to reshape competition and innovation in the digital landscape. Adding to the week's significant shifts, President Trump announced the relocation of the U.S. Space Command headquarters from Colorado to Huntsville, Alabama, reversing a decision made by former President Joe Biden. Trump explicitly linked his decision to Colorado's use of mail-in voting, which he described as a very corrupt voting system, alongside Alabama's perceived greater effort in lobbying for the command. This move, which will bring an estimated 1,400 jobs to Huntsville's Redstone Arsenal over the next 5 years, has been met with outrage by Colorado officials. Governor Jared Polis, a Democrat, condemned the decision as deeply disappointing, arguing it diminishes military readiness and national security and erodes the trust Americans have in our country and its leaders to do the right thing, while also pointing to wasted taxpayer dollars and inconvenience for military families. The controversy underscores the political weaponization of federal appointments and the significant economic and strategic impact such decisions carry for states. Internationally, the administration demonstrated its assertive stance, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirming a U.S. military strike in the Caribbean against a vessel accused of smuggling drugs from Venezuela. An attack President Trump later claimed killed 11 alleged members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. Trump, who has repeatedly accused Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro of controlling such groups without providing evidence, a claim even contradicted by a declassified U.S. intelligence report, designated Tren de Aragua a foreign terrorist organization earlier this year. This action has raised alarms among Latin American leaders concerned about the potential for U.S. military intervention on their soil. Concurrently, the Department of Homeland Security announced an offer to pay salaries and benefits for state and local law enforcement officers who cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, a move aimed at bolstering deportation campaigns, including those targeting individuals without criminal records. Critics warn this approach erodes trust between vulnerable communities and local police. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron called on the U.S. to reverse its decision to revoke or deny visas for Palestinian Authority and Palestinian Liberation Organization officials ahead of the upcoming United Nations General Assembly, citing the host country agreement. Domestically, the administration's reach extended to financial institutions, with nearly 600 economists signing a letter in support of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, whom Trump has moved to fire over alleged mortgage fraud. The economists argued that such actions threaten the fundamental principle of central bank independence and undermine trust in one of America's most important institutions, highlighting the ongoing pressure on the U.S. central bank. In a separate but related development, a federal appeals court ruled that most of the president's sweeping global tariffs were unlawful, a decision Trump immediately vowed to appeal to the Supreme Court, framing it as a liberal court's costly judgment. Collectively, these events paint a vivid picture of an administration aggressively leveraging executive power, frequently clashing with state governments and established institutions, and navigating complex legal and international challenges. The coming months are poised to see these battles escalate, particularly with anticipated appeals in the Google antitrust case, further legal challenges to National Guard deployments, and the intensifying political rhetoric surrounding the upcoming elections. The delicate balance between federal authority, state rights, and the independence of critical institutions remains a central defining feature of this dynamic period. In an era increasingly defined by rapid-fire digital discourse and the persistent blurring of lines between fact and fiction, recent events involving President Donald Trump have vividly underscored the challenges facing public information and institutional credibility. From viral social media rumors about his health to a renewed, albeit scientifically settled, debate over COVID-19 vaccine efficacy, the past week has seen a confluence of narratives that highlight the volatile landscape of modern communication and its profound implications for public trust and health. The Labor Day weekend saw an unusual surge of speculation across social media platforms regarding President Trump's health, with unsubstantiated rumors of his death or rapidly declining condition going viral. These baseless claims were reportedly fueled by a combination of factors: a multi-day absence from public appearances following a cabinet meeting characterized by extreme flattery, persistent bruising on the back of his hand that the White House had previously attributed to excessive handshakes or attempted to conceal with poorly matched foundation, and earlier revelations about the 79-year-old president suffering from poor circulation. On Tuesday, President Trump publicly dismissed these rumors as fake news during a press conference announcing the relocation of the U.S. Space Command headquarters, claiming he was unaware of the widespread speculation. However, sources within his administration, including one official who stated he fucking sees everything, contradicted his denial, confirming that the president was indeed aware of the online chatter. This episode echoes past instances where Trump has publicly denied knowledge of viral online content, such as the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2020, despite being briefed. The pervasive nature of such digital misinformation was further exemplified by a satirical fake truth social post which went viral, claiming Trump had mused about transcendental logic and Immanuel Kant, a clear fabrication originating as a joke on Blue Sky using Wikipedia text. This incident, along with the death rumors, illustrates the ease with which fabricated or exaggerated content can propagate online, often challenging the public's ability to discern truth, especially when it concerns high-profile figures. Concurrently, President Trump ignited a familiar controversy with a Truth Social post questioning the effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines and demanding proof from manufacturers, suggesting the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention (CDC) was being ripped apart over a question he asserted had been answered long ago. This demand, though framed as a search for data, arrives amidst a well-established scientific consensus. Clinical trials for the initial Pfizer-BioNTech shots, for instance, demonstrated an impressive 95% efficacy against symptomatic infection, with Moderna and Novavax reporting similarly high figures. Post-rollout, countless real-world studies globally have consistently affirmed their effectiveness. Every country has done their own real-world analysis, noted Deepta Bhattacharya, an immunologist at the University of Arizona. While the original vaccines became less effective at preventing infection as the coronavirus evolved, they continued to offer robust protection against severe disease and death. Between late September 2023 and August 2024 alone, these vaccines are estimated to have averted over 107,000 hospitalizations and nearly 7,000 deaths in the United States. Even the most recent vaccines introduced in the fall of 2024, with data showing about 45% effectiveness against hospitalization, are considered significant, especially given widespread population immunity from prior infection and vaccination. John Werry, director of the Institute for Immunology and Immune Health at the University of Pennsylvania, emphasized that even a 45% efficacy is not nothing, not only from the standpoint of disease burden, also highlighting their substantial role in decreasing healthcare costs. The data supporting vaccine efficacy has been publicly accessible since the outset. The Food and Drug Administration (FDA) mandated companies to submit comprehensive data for emergency use authorization, and these results were subsequently published in leading scientific journals. Manufacturers also presented their findings at public meetings of independent advisory panels for the FDA and CDC, where experts extensively discussed and voted on authorization and recommendation. CDC scientists have been tracking the effectiveness of COVID vaccines since they were first rolled out to the public, stated Dr. Fiona Havers, who led a CDC team collecting hospitalization data before her resignation in June. She further asserted that multiple systems at the agency show that the vaccines have prevented hospitalizations and deaths. President Trump's recent demand for proof, however, stands in stark contrast to the administration's broader approach to public health, particularly under Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has been accused of blatantly misrepresenting the data and calling COVID-19 vaccines the deadliest ever made. The CDC itself is reportedly in turmoil, a situation Dr. Havers attributes not to the vaccine efficacy question but to attacks from within this administration. Since taking office in February, Secretary Kennedy has overseen the layoff of thousands of agency employees, slashed its budget and contracts by half, fired its entire panel of vaccine advisors, and ousted its director. This internal upheaval, compounded by a recent terrorist attack on the agency, has created an environment of instability and distrust, further complicating the CDC's mission and public perception. These intertwined narratives, the rapid spread of online rumors, the president's engagement with and denial of them, and the administration's contentious stance on established scientific facts regarding public health paint a concerning picture. They highlight the vulnerability of the information ecosystem to manipulation and the ongoing challenge for public institutions to maintain credibility in a politically charged environment. As technology continues to accelerate the dissemination of information, both true and false, the onus grows heavier on platforms, public figures, and individuals to critically evaluate sources and foster an environment where evidence-based discourse can prevail over sensationalism and deliberate misinformation. The future of public health and informed civic engagement hinges on navigating this complex landscape with greater discernment and a renewed commitment to verifiable facts. The United States finds itself at a pivotal juncture, grappling with a confluence of political, economic, and technological shifts that are reshaping its domestic landscape and global standing. As the White House recently addressed lingering questions about the president's public presence, the broader narrative emerging from financial capitals and statehouses alike points to a nation navigating increasingly turbulent waters, prompting warnings of a profound systemic transformation. One of the most striking alarms has been sounded by hedge fund billionaire Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, who told the Financial Times that he sees America drifting towards 1930s-style autocratic politics. Dalio attributes this worrying trend to widening gaps in wealth and gaps in values, coupled with a collapse in trust, all driving more extreme policies. He draws parallels to the 1930 to 40 period globally, citing instances of state intervention in the private sector such as President Trump's acquisition of a 10% stake in chipmaker Intel, as examples of the strong autocratic leadership that sprang out of the desire to take control of the financial and economic situation. Dalio's critique is particularly rare from a prominent financial figure, and he noted that most people are silent because they are afraid of retaliation if they criticize, underscoring a climate of apprehension. This concern over centralized control extends to the very institutions designed to safeguard economic stability. Dalio specifically warned about threats to the Federal Reserve's independence coming days after President Trump's unprecedented move to sack one of its governors and his nomination of a close ally to the Fed board, ostensibly to push for rapid and deep cuts to borrowing costs. A politically weakened central bank, Dalio asserts, would undermine the confidence in the Fed defending the value of money and make holding dollar-denominated debt assets less attractive, which would weaken the monetary order as we know it. Indeed, nearly 600 economists have signed a letter in support of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, who was fighting her removal in court, calling the unproven accusations against her and the attempt to oust her a threat to central bank independence and public trust. Already, international investors have reportedly begun shifting out of treasuries into gold, signaling a potential erosion of confidence in the dollar. Beyond monetary policy, Dalio projects a looming debt-induced heart attack for the U.S. economy within 3 to 5 years, a culmination of many years of big deficits and unsustainable debt growth overseen by presidents from both parties. He highlights a stark imbalance where Washington spends approximately $7 trillion annually while raising only $5 trillion in revenue, necessitating massive new debt issuance at a time when investors are questioning the reliability of treasuries as good storeholds of wealth. This supply-demand imbalance, Dalio warns, will force the Fed into a difficult choice: allow interest rates to go up and have a debt default crisis, or print money and buy the debt that others won't buy, with both paths ultimately harming the dollar. The impulse towards state control and unilateral action is also manifesting in domestic security and trade. President Trump recently announced intentions to deploy the National Guard to cities he described as hellholes, including Chicago and Baltimore, stating, "We're going in." Illinois Democratic Governor J.B. Pritzker vehemently pushed back, calling the president's remarks unhinged and refusing to request federal troops. Pritzker claimed federal agents from ICE, Customs and Border Patrol, and DHS, along with the Texas National Guard, were already being staged around Chicago, anticipating raids on Latino communities and a pretext to deploy active-duty military. This mirrors a situation in California where a federal appeals court ruled Trump's deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles illegal, prompting Governor Gavin Newsom to file an injunction against extending the deployment, labeling it intimidation tactics, through Election Day. Simultaneously, the Department of Homeland Security is offering to pay the salaries and benefits of state and local law enforcement officers who cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, a move expected to ramp up ICE operations and raise concerns among advocates about creating distrust in vulnerable communities. On the trade front, a federal appeals court recently dealt a significant blow to the administration's unilateral trade policy, ruling most of the president's sweeping global tariffs unlawful. President Trump has vowed to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court, claiming the court was liberal and would cost the country billions. This legal challenge underscores the ongoing tension between executive authority and judicial oversight in shaping economic policy. The tech sector also saw significant developments, with a federal judge in an antitrust lawsuit against Google owner Alphabet ruling that the tech giant must share information with competitors and tightening restrictions on its exclusive agreements. While Judge Amit Mehta stopped short of ordering a breakup of the company, a remedy sought by federal prosecutors, the Department of Justice is reportedly considering next options, signaling continued scrutiny of big tech's market dominance. Separately, the administration announced the relocation of the U.S. Space Command headquarters from Colorado to Alabama, with the president citing Colorado's use of mail-in voting as a reason, a decision that has sparked criticism for its apparent political motivation. In foreign policy, The administration confirmed a U.S. military strike in the Caribbean against a vessel allegedly transporting narcotics from Venezuela, claiming it killed 11 members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, which Trump designated a foreign terrorist organization. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed the lethal strike, but Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro has long accused the U.S. of interfering in his country's politics, and a declassified U.S. intelligence memo earlier this year appeared to contradict Trump's repeated assertions of Maduro's direct links to such groups. This assertive posture in the Caribbean raises alarms among Latin American leaders about potential military interventions. Furthermore, the Trump administration's decision to revoke or deny visas for Palestinian Authority and Palestinian Liberation Organization officials ahead of the United Nations General Assembly drew condemnation from French President Emmanuel Macron, who called for the measure to be reversed to ensure Palestinian representation. These multifaceted developments, from profound economic warnings and challenges to democratic norms to assertive federal actions both domestically and abroad, paint a picture of a nation in flux. The coming months will likely test the resilience of American institutions, the stability of its economic framework, and its relationships on the global stage as these trends continue to unfold and shape the future trajectory of the United States. In a dramatic escalation that could fundamentally reshape American trade policy and inject fresh volatility into the global economy, President Trump has signaled his intent to seek an expedited Supreme Court review as early as Wednesday to protect his administration's broad tariff powers. This move comes on the heels of a federal appeals court ruling that deemed many of his recently imposed duties illegal, setting the stage for a high-stakes legal battle with profound economic and diplomatic ramifications. The controversy stems from a ruling by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which late last Friday determined in a 7-4 decision that President Trump had vastly overstepped his authority by using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act (IEPA) to impose steep tariffs on a wide array of U.S. trading partners. This decision echoed an earlier lower court ruling in May, both concluding that Congress never intended to grant the president unbounded powers under IEPA for such expansive tariff implementation. For now, the appeals court has allowed the tariffs to remain in place until October 14, providing a critical window for the White House to mount its appeal. President Trump reacted forcefully to the appeals court's decision, branding it very shocking and criticizing the court as liberal and radical left in social media posts throughout the weekend. Speaking at the White House on Tuesday, he argued that any erosion of his ability to impose levies using IEPA would inflict severe financial damage on the United States, robbing it of both revenue and crucial leverage in international negotiations. If you took away tariffs, we could end up being a third-world country, Mr. Trump asserted, linking the legal uncertainty to a recent drop in financial markets and warning of potential devastation for our country. He even contended that the stock market needs the tariffs, a claim that economists often dispute given that investors have frequently recoiled from tariff announcements. The president also raised concerns that a loss could jeopardize billions of dollars in collected revenue which the U.S. might be forced to repay, and undermine his efforts to incentivize domestic manufacturing. Economists generally believe that the president has overstated the immediate magnitude of the case, yet the legal battle introduces a significant new layer of uncertainty into an already fragile economic outlook. According to an analysis by economists at UBS, an upholding of the appeals court's decision could invalidate approximately 75% of the wide-ranging tariffs Trump has imposed in recent months. This uncertainty has already had tangible effects, with Shelley Kaushik, a senior economist at BMO Capital Markets, noting that it adds yet another layer of tariff uncertainty to kick off September. Businesses facing potential long-term consequences on supply chains, hiring, and investment decisions have largely adopted a wait-and-see approach. Mark Sandy, chief economist at Moody's Analytics, articulated this concern, stating that most of the damage so far is just the uncertainty that they've created, and which has caused businesses and the Federal Reserve to kind of sit on their hands. He added that this uncertainty is a primary reason for a hiring slowdown, risking a broader economic recession. The Federal Reserve, too, has maintained a cautious stance on interest rates, awaiting clarity on the tariff campaign's trajectory. The legal challenge to IEEPA-based tariffs highlights a core dispute over presidential authority. Congress enacted IEEPA in the 1970s primarily to empower the president to impose sanctions and embargoes in response to emerging global threats, not as a tool for broad arbitrary tariff imposition. Legal scholars across the political spectrum have raised myriad objections to the administration's expansive interpretation of the statute. While the White House is pushing for an expedited Supreme Court review, it remains unclear if the justices will grant such a timeline, and the administration faces an uphill battle given the widespread legal skepticism. Should the Supreme Court ultimately rule against the administration, President Trump does possess other statutory tools for imposing tariffs, but these are significantly more limited than the emergency powers he has invoked. Statutes like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, often used for national security tariffs on specific products like steel and automobiles which were unaffected by Friday's ruling, typically require lengthy consultations and investigations, preventing instant adjustments. Other provisions such as Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 allow for duties of up to 15% globally for a maximum of 150 days, while Section 301 addresses unfair trading practices after investigations. Even the long-in-used Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 permits tariffs of up to 50% against discriminatory trade practices. However, none of these alternatives offer the instant and seemingly without limit flexibility the president has sought under IEEPA. Mr. Trump has indicated he would not attempt to push his tariffs through Congress, citing a lack of votes in the Senate. Internationally, the ruling has triggered cautious reactions, particularly among America's largest trading partners. U.S. officials have expressed concerns that a loss could lead to diplomatic embarrassment and the unwinding of existing trade deals, especially those brokered with the European Union and other nations that were predicated on IEEPA-imposed tariffs. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick warned that such an outcome could lead to retaliation and the unwinding of agreed-upon deals by foreign trading partners and derail critical ongoing negotiations. European leaders, while acknowledging the U.S. court decision, are likely to proceed with caution. Mujtaba Rahman, who leads European research for Eurasia Group, suggested that tearing up a deal due to a U.S. court ruling would be rubbing salt in Trump's wound and risk triggering backlash. Karsten Brzezinski at ING in Germany echoed this sentiment, stating that the EU would be very cautious in reacting to it, at least in public. For importers, the ruling offers a glimmer of hope. Angela Emma Santos, a partner at Fox Schiff, noted that it was great news for importers, potentially paving the way for refunds on tariffs already paid. However, she cautioned that this dispute is far from over. The decision might be limited in scope and importers may not see relief for some time. Whitney Shepherdson, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, emphasized that even with alternative legal routes it would take time to replicate the full set of tariffs that he has introduced under IEEPA. And it will be difficult to replicate the broad sweep of the current tariffs. This sustained uncertainty means that most firms will be reluctant to make the large multi-year investments needed to reconfigure supply chains until there is clarity. As the Supreme Court weighs whether to take up the appeal on an expedited basis, the coming weeks will prove pivotal for the future of U.S. trade policy, the stability of the global economy, and the extent of presidential power. The outcome will not only determine the fate of billions of dollars in tariffs and the trajectory of numerous businesses, but also redefine the balance between executive authority and legislative intent in shaping America's economic engagement with the world. The period leading up to October 14 and potentially beyond promises to be one of intense legal and economic speculation. With the global markets closely watching the highest court in the land, in a move reverberating through the nation's defense establishment and political landscape, former President Donald Trump announced on Tuesday, September 2, 2025, that the headquarters for U.S. Space Command Spacecom will be relocated from Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs, Colorado to Huntsville, Alabama. This decision reignites a contentious years-long debate over the command's permanent home, effectively reversing an earlier directive from the Biden administration and setting the stage for significant operational and logistical challenges.
The announcement made by President Trump underscores his administration's commitment to bolstering America's capabilities in the final frontier.
Most importantly, this decision will help America defend and dominate the high frontier, Trump stated during a press conference in the Oval Office, signaling a renewed focus on strategic positioning for military space operations.
Spacecom re-established in 2019.
Is the combatant command responsible for coordinating critical military activities in space, including satellite communications, defensive operations, and missile warning and defense? The relocation saga has been a prominent and often acrimonious turf war within the Defense Department and Congress since Spacecom's inception. Following his first term, Trump had initially selected Huntsville, home to the Army's Redstone Arsenal and Missile Defense Command, as the preferred headquarters in 2021, just before leaving the White House. However, that decision was subsequently overturned in 2023 by the Biden administration, which opted to keep the command in Colorado Springs, citing concerns about readiness and potential disruptions. This latest pronouncement by President Trump marks a full circle, returning to his original preference and once again unsettling the command's future. Much of the debate has centered on a fundamental tension between cost-effectiveness and operational readiness, as revealed by multiple investigations. Both the Pentagon's Office of the Inspector General (OIG) and the Government Accountability Office (GAO) conducted separate probes into the Defense Department's basing review process. These investigations, including a second DoD-OIG report published in April, consistently found that early studies by the Department of the Air Force (DAF) identified moving Spacecom to Alabama as the most cost-effective option. However, these same reports highlighted significant concerns from Space Command leadership and, by extension, the Biden administration regarding the time and resources required for such a move. Specifically, Space Command leadership voiced apprehension that a relocation would negatively impact overall readiness, expressing doubts about personnel willingness to relocate and estimating that it would take roughly 3 to 4 years to construct new facilities and establish secure communications at a new site.
As one OIG report noted,
DAF officials described the cost to the taxpayer as the primary driver of its preference for Redstone Arsenal as the permanent location for Spacecom's permanent HQ, while Spacecom leadership prioritized minimizing the risk to readiness. This stark divergence in priorities has been at the heart of the protracted dispute, with lawmakers from both Colorado and Alabama vigorously lobbying for their respective states. The implications of this latest decision are far-reaching. While Huntsville stands to gain a significant economic and strategic boost, Colorado Springs faces the loss of a major military installation and the associated personnel and infrastructure. More critically, the operational impact on Spacecom's mission remains a key concern.
A move of this magnitude, requiring several years for full transition,
could introduce a period of instability for a command vital to national security in an increasingly contested space domain. The back-and-forth nature of the decision also raises questions about the long-term stability of strategic defense planning, potentially creating uncertainty for military personnel and their families. As the dust settles on this renewed directive, the focus will inevitably shift to the practicalities of implementation, the management of personnel transitions, and the ultimate effect on America's ability to maintain its competitive edge in the high frontier. The global geopolitical landscape is undergoing a profound and rapid transformation, with recent international summits and diplomatic exchanges laying bare a stark new reality shaped by the United States' evolving foreign policy under President Donald Trump. As the world grapples with a less predictable Washington, major powers like China and Russia are seizing opportunities, recalibrating their strategies, and subtly reshaping global power dynamics, often to the detriment of traditional Western alliances. This shift, highlighted by analyses from institutions like the Royal United Services Institute (RUSI) and observed in high-profile meetings, suggests a new era where strategic patience and opportunism are becoming Beijing's most potent diplomatic tools. A central theme emerging from recent events, particularly the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska and subsequent meetings involving European leaders and President Zelensky in Washington, is the profound inconsistency of President Trump's diplomacy. While Beijing typically prefers predictability and stability in international relations, it has astutely adopted a wait-and-see posture, exploiting the vacuums created by a transactional and often unpredictable U.S. foreign policy. As Dr. Sari Arhohavran of RUSI notes, this pattern of capitalizing on U.S.-created voids, especially in multilateral and rule-setting arenas,
is likely to intensify.
This dynamic is already manifesting in slow shifts in international standards driven by China, increased compliance risks for businesses, and a potential extended dependency on Chinese-led institutions. Analysts like Dewey, director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, and Yun Sun, director of the China program at the Stimson Center, agree that Trump's actions, including alienating allies and dismantling agencies like USAID, directly benefit China by diminishing American power and resistance to Beijing's expanding outreach.
This allows China to improve ties with U.S. allies, capitalize on vulnerabilities, and position itself as a stable alternative on the global stage. The erosion of trust within the transatlantic alliance has not escaped Beijing's notice. China has long viewed Europe through the lens of the United States, often portraying it as merely a U.S. puppet while actively encouraging European strategic autonomy. This narrative supports China's preference for a weakened or even dismantled transatlantic alliance. The changed tone in Trump's diplomacy towards Europe during his second term was quickly exploited. As early as March 2025, Liu She, China's special envoy for European affairs, expressed his appalled reaction to how the Trump administration treated its European allies, urging European friends to compare Washington's policies with China's goodwill and win-win cooperation. Liu She even hinted that any peace deal for Ukraine should involve China, not just the US and Russia, signaling Beijing's ambition for a central role. The perceived transactional and unreliable nature of U.S. diplomacy, even with its closest allies, creates fertile ground for China to exploit divisions across Europe and Asia, reinforcing Beijing's narrative of a declining West and serving as a cautionary tale for regions like Taiwan and the Philippines. Adding to the diplomatic disarray, reports from Japan today highlight a pattern of Trump's envoys ticking off other countries, with the White House often offering little in the way of damage control. Incidents like the summoning of U.S. diplomats in Denmark over covert influence operations in Greenland, or the French summoning of U.S. Ambassador Charles Kushner over an accusatory letter to President Macron, underscore a blunt-spoken America-first approach that often antagonizes allies. The casual White House response, such as telling the Danes need to calm down, reflects a broader disregard for traditional diplomatic norms. This approach, while appealing to Trump's political base, risks alienating crucial allies. As Iver B. Newman, director of the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, cautions, while the U.S.-China rivalry is paramount, a major U.S. asset in this competition is its network of allies, an asset potentially squandered by current policy. The tendency to hand coveted diplomatic postings to campaign donors and presidential friends, regardless of their experience, further exacerbates these issues, leading to frequent diplomatic kerfuffles that, according to former State Department officials, President Trump sometimes relishes for the publicity. Meanwhile, Russia, once isolated, is experiencing a diplomatic resurgence. The New York Times reports that at the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization SCO summit in Tianjin, President Vladimir Putin was glad, handing leaders a stark contrast to his isolated demeanor 3 years prior. With President Trump helping ease his isolation, Putin gleefully interacted with Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India and President Xi Jinping of China, publicly blaming the West for the war in Ukraine. The summit's final communiqué notably omitted any mention of the war, signaling a collective shift in focus. Before the Alaska summit, Putin had assured Xi that strategic partnership coordination between Russia and China will not change under any circumstances, a testament to their deepening bond. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov even suggested that the real security guarantees for Ukraine would have to involve its biggest ally, China, further cementing Beijing's perceived indispensable role. While China officially condemns alliances as Cold War relics, its model partnership for a new era with Russia and its leadership in multilateral structures like the SCO and BRICS are clearly tools to advance its geopolitical ambitions.
Michael Kimmage of the Kennan Institute notes that Russia's skilled diplomacy has built a network of relationships that legitimize the Putin system and cushion the war's impact, aligning with the Sino-Russian argument that the US is a source of disorder.
For China,
the symbolic nature of the Alaska summit and the subsequent US-Europe tensions have been highly advantageous. Chinese state media portrayed the Alaska meeting as a way for Russia to break diplomatic deadlock and for the US to act in isolation, much to Beijing's satisfaction.
This allows China to avoid secondary sanctions and keeps US attention diverted from the Indo-Pacific.
European anxieties, particularly regarding commitment to supporting Ukraine, have also been noted in Beijing, leading China to strengthen ties with less supportive EU members like Hungary and Spain and non-EU states such as Serbia and Georgia. The lack of formal resolutions from recent meetings effectively buys time for Russia, which in turn secures China from immediate tariffs and allows it to advance its geopolitical agenda, particularly in the global south where China already holds numerous defense agreements.
A prolonged war in Ukraine,
coupled with fluctuating U.S. policy and weakening European unity due to economic fatigue and political divisions, presents a scenario that, while terrible for Europe, could significantly benefit China in the long run.
Even within the U.S., domestic policies under the Trump administration appear to inadvertently aid Beijing.
The South China Morning Post highlights how a radical overhaul of the U.S. State Department could play into Beijing's hands for decades, making the effort to counter China's global footprint more difficult.
The administration's seemingly contradictory stance, welcoming 600,000 Chinese students while Republican lawmakers dismantle academic partnerships, further illustrates internal inconsistencies.
Furthermore, American farmers increasingly rely on Chinese drones like those from DJI, despite Washington's security concerns, showcasing China's pervasive technological influence even in the U.S. heartland.
In conclusion,
the recent cascade of international events and diplomatic shifts presents a clear picture of more upside than downside for China. President Trump's unpredictability, coupled with a transactional approach to allies and a willingness to upend diplomatic norms, has created a fertile environment for Beijing to advance its strategic interests. China has skillfully exploited these vacuums and divisions, strengthening its no-limits partnership with Russia, deepening ties with non-aligned nations, and positioning itself as a stable, credible alternative to a seemingly erratic Washington. While immediate security dependencies might prevent most European countries from overtly confronting the U.S. and trade, China's sedulous engagement efforts with Brussels, including proposals for Ukraine's reconstruction and peacekeeping, aim at its long-term goal of dividing Western unity. As long as Presidents Xi and Putin remain in power, Beijing can rely on Moscow's partnership. The ongoing war in Ukraine has had minimal negative consequences for China and its leverage through critical minerals dependence, coupled with over a decade of building self-reliance, positions it strongly even against potential heightened trade wars. Chinese sources consistently frame these developments as evidence of declining U.S. hegemony and the accelerating emergence of a multipolar world where Beijing sees itself in a strong, influential position ready to shape the post-war order and beyond.